So, Peter, let's just start with which countries have actually escaped Trump's tariffs and why have they been granted these really rare exemptions?
Yes, it's a great point that's largely been overlooked because the administration, Pete Navarro, Trump's trade advisor, has been insisting on no exemptions, even testifying before the Congress in the last day or so. We've seen the US Trade Representative, Jamison Greer, saying, no, we can't have any exemptions because if you start opening up one, you'll end up with a Swiss cheese, there'll be holes everywhere and it won't mean anything. And yet, despite all that rhetoric, in reality, a number of countries have been exempted, including 4 traditional enemies of the US, remarkably. Some people have pointed out that Russia got an exemption, but also Russia's ally, Belarus, was exempted from these new tariffs. So was North Korea, and so was Cuba. These are countries that the US has been prepared in the past to put its very existence on the line to defeat and to defend against, and now they're getting special treatment from these so-called universal Trump tariffs. They're not universal at all. I think the whole world has puzzled over this, but all the indications are and continue to be affirmed by things like this decision that Trump has some strange theological connection with Vladimir Putin that we don't really understand. But it doesn't matter. It's obviously a political decision by Donald Trump to exclude those 4 traditional US enemies from these new tariffs. That's a pretty interesting signal to send at a time when he is antagonizing and harming almost all traditional US allies.
Okay, so that's alarming in itself, but then we've got to talk about the news that really is exploding on the day that we're recording this Wednesday morning, and this is when Trump's additional tariff on China has risen to 104%. Now, this obviously is a result of an escalating tit-for-tat tariff war with the country. So what's this going to do?
Well, I think it's a seismic moment. If Trump persists with these tariffs and the Chinese retaliate, as they've said they will.
如果美方置两国和国际社会的利益于不顾，执意打关税战、贸易战，中方必将奉陪到底。
Unless somebody walks away from this, it's been likened to a game of chicken with 2 high-speed trains rushing at each other, or cars, which one's going to veer away. Unless somebody veers away, we could look back on this as a pivotal moment in modern history, and here's the reason. A tariff of 100% plus on Chinese imports into the US, and there were about $400 billion worth last year. It's the biggest, if you look at the two-way trade between the US and China, it's the biggest two-way trade flow on the planet, and that's just goods excluding services, $400 billion US a year. 100% tariff on China's imports into the US is effectively an embargo. Effectively, that will destroy probably the great bulk of China's sales to America. Now, that's a pretty dramatic thing to do. That will deprive China of a lot of export revenue. It will deprive Chinese companies of a lot of the supply chains that they've built up. It imposes an impossible new tax on this very large flow of trade.
I just spoke to the president about this, and he believes that China wants to make a deal with the United States. He believes China has to make a deal with the United States. It was a mistake for China to retaliate. The president, when America is punched, he punches back harder. That's why there will be 104% tariffs going into effect on China tonight at midnight. But the president believes that she and China want to make a deal. They just don't know how to get that started.
The lesson of history here, Samantha, is that when the US applied an economic embargo, in that case an oil embargo, on Japan, Imperial Japan in 1941, as punishment for Japan's territorial aggression in the Pacific, that was the tipping point that brought Japan into the Pacific War. That was the tipping point where Tokyo decided, under the dictatorship of the time, decided to attack the US, famously at Pearl Harbor, but also all US and British and Dutch interests throughout the Pacific. That launched the Pacific War. Now, that's the potential power of such an aggressive trade embargo on a country that depends on that trade. Now, we're still a few steps away from that, but it is a lesson from history that we should not ignore.
So you're saying this is a feasible, possible outcome from this, is that this trade war could actually lead to a hot war, in particular between the United States and China? Like, is that an alarmist question to ask at this point?
I don't think it's alarmist at all, because both countries have been contemplating exactly that for years. We know that there has been often labelled a Cold War or a new Cold War evolving. There's been talk of decoupling, de-risking between the US and China for years. And that sometimes the political relationship gets better, sometimes worse. But Donald Trump has taken office with an initial conciliatory gesture to China, saying, oh, yes, let's talk about our problems, now to saying, I'm not even going to talk to China. They have to approach me if they want any relief from these tariffs, and going fully aggressive and saying we might even terminate the talks that our officials have been having about talking. And at the same time, as we know, on the Chinese side, the build-up of their military, which has already created the biggest navy in the world, considerably bigger than America's, is continuing apace. So is their nuclear stockpile and nuclear armament program. While the rhetoric from people in the Trump administration is very hostile to China as well. Now, the debate for years has been, if it's Taiwan, if China takes aggressive action against Taiwan, will the US defend it? We don't know. What if it's in some other theatre? What if it's in the South China Sea? What if push comes to shove? The Chinese Air Force, we found out a little over a year ago that the Chinese Air Force has engaged in dangerous mid-air encounters deliberately engineered on more than 200 occasions with the US Air Force over the preceding 4 years. And finally, the Pentagon released these statistics to say, this is an accident waiting to happen if this continues. So this clash has been building. Xi Jinping, final point on how the build-up has been going. Xi Jinping for 2 or 3 years now has been saying repeatedly to the Chinese people, in remarks which would get very rarely reported in the West, but he's been saying we have to prepare the Chinese economy and the Chinese people to weather extreme storms and extreme circumstances. He's had this so-called dual circulation policy. The dual circulation policy is effectively trying to create self-dependency in as many areas of food and other supplies as possible. He's been girding for this moment. He's been girding for a potential hot war. He's been girding for a crisis. And now Xi Jinping cannot and will not step back from a confrontation with Trump. It's a matter of national pride and, for him, political survival. If he's seen to be backing down to the US, that will be cataclysmic for Xi Jinping's leadership. And Trump has now put his credibility on the line, such as it is, as well.
Which is so interesting. And it brings me to my next question, because there's been so much focus, of course, on the economic global chaos that has resulted from Trump's tariffs. But I am wondering if perhaps on the Trump side, if these tariffs are perhaps more about Trump showing off his, unfettered power, or cementing that in the minds of leaders around the globe. Do you think that's possibly the case here?
I think it's all the indications are, and analysing Donald Trump's motivations is always fraught. But if you look at what he's said and done, it is about flexing his political and egotistical, megalomaniacal, if you like, power in front of the American public, but also by doing that by imposing his will on foreign countries. And it's in his rhetoric as well, where he says now that he's doing this. He's asserting an American vengeance against these countries that have been raping and pillaging the US for years, and that they have to come to him. I'm not going to go to them, he says. They have to come to me. In other words, they have to bend the knee and capitulate before I'll deal with them. So that's absolutely about asserting some sort of macho power over foreign countries as a way of asserting dominance, but also impressing the MAGA crowd and the American public in general. I think that's central to the motivation for this, and it's been building in his mind for a long time. And finally, he's here. And as he said just in the last few hours, he said, "Nobody but me would do this." And that's for sure.
Yeah, that is for certain. But let's talk about, what pushback there's been within the United States to what Trump's been doing, because I did want to ask you about what may be called a burgeoning mini rebellion, I guess, from within the Republican Party against Trump's tariffs, because we know that there is a bipartisan bill to give Congress the final veto on Trump's tariffs, right? So tell me about that.
That's true. In both the House and the Senate, bipartisan groups of legislators have got together to put up bills which insist on the congressional prerogative of deciding tariff policy as set out in the US Constitution, and that Trump is trying to do some sort of end run around the Constitution by using an emergency economic power act, which they think would not stand up in court. So Congress is saying, no, it's our power, not yours, and we don't trust the way you're implementing it. However, at this particular moment, there doesn't seem to be enough support in either house for those to pass, and Donald Trump is threatening to veto such a bill anyway. Now, they could counter a presidential veto, but they would need a supermajority in both houses, which looks, on the current numbers, unlikely. But if we're going to talk about future possibilities, we also have to think about other possible developments in the meantime. Look at what's happening, the carnage in the world financial markets, which as we speak has just dramatically been aggravated by the developments with the extra tariff on China. As we speak, there was a tentative recovery in financial markets. Today, that's evaporated. Stocks are falling. Commodity prices are falling. The iron ore price, the oil price are all indicating growing investor expectations that we are heading into a global recession. So unless these tariffs are wound back fairly briskly, that is where we are heading. Now, that sort of pressure on the Republicans, on the US voter, as their 401k life savings start to collapse under the weight of these market falls, that could change the sentiment in the Congress, and that could well change the balance. But this is the future, and that's always speculative.
Yeah, it is. But I did want to add to that it's not just this bipartisan bill. We've also seen a bit of pushback from other forces, supporters of the Republican Party, because we saw a tweet the other day from American billionaire Bill Ackman. He helped fund the Trump campaign, and he was calling for a pause in tariffs. And then Elon Musk, too, has said he wants a world of zero tariffs between the U.S. and the EU specifically. So I know this is conjecture here, Peter, but I do wonder, could we reach a tipping point where this just becomes too much, even for MAGA supporters?
Yes. Absolutely, because as their life savings in those 401k accounts, the Australian equivalent of which is your super account, as those life savings fall and the economy in the US contracts and prices on shop shelves rise, that will exert a lot of pressure on middle America. It will test the MAGA mob's confidence in Donald Trump. Remember, this administration's only 3 months old, and most of the MAGA sentiment is still with Trump. But the majority of the American public now say they do not like tariffs. Trump's economic approval ratings are falling. So this is all now in play. The big question that is bruited everywhere around the world, including to Trump directly in the last hours, is, are these tariffs temporary? Is this just a negotiating front that you're putting up and you're prepared to retreat to extract as you extract concessions from trading partners? Or is this permanent? And Trump has said both can be true. Confronted with that question, is this permanent or temporary? He said both can be true. So riddle me that, Samantha.
Yeah, that's right. I guess we're back to the madman theory of foreign diplomacy that many think that he subscribes to. But Peter, let's turn to Australia, because I wanted to ask you about the attempts that our leaders have been making behind the scenes, because you've just written about this, to strike a deal with Trump. So tell me what they are.
So we know that the Friday before Liberation Day, so-called, liberating Americans from their life savings, that's right, when Trump announced his tariff impositions, that the Kevin Rudd, as ambassador to Washington, presented the two cabinet-level officials of the Trump administration, the US Trade Representative Greer and the Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick, with a package of proposals, a deal that they were seeking to exempt Australia from the tariffs. And the feedback that Don Farrell, the Australian Trade Minister, went on the record to discuss this with me. He said that the messages we were getting from that meeting were very positive. We thought they were well inclined. We thought there was a real chance we would get an exemption. But then the phones, they stopped answering their phones over the subsequent days. And the Australians realised that the deal had been overruled, and they heard that Pete Navarro, trade advisor to Trump, had overruled the two cabinet-level secretaries and said, no, there can be no exemptions, which of course we now know to be ridiculous, but it was applied to Australia and that stuck. So now, what are the elements of that proposal? And it remains relevant because that proposal, Don Farrell told me, is still on the table on Trump's desk if he should choose to take it.
Australia bans, and they're wonderful people and wonderful everything, but they ban American beef, yet we imported $3 billion of Australian beef from them just last year alone. They won't take any of our beef. They don't want it because they don't want it to affect their farmers. And you know what? I don't blame them, but we're doing the same thing right now, starting about midnight tonight, I would say.
The only component of it we know for sure is that there is some offer to jointly develop critical minerals, and including rare earths that Australia has in abundance, to give the US a reliable supply chain, which is valuable to the US because they are It's valuable to the US because they are very exposed to China's stranglehold on current global supply. Australia has, as Kevin Rudd repeatedly tells American interlocutors, if you look at a map of Australia, you're looking at the periodic table. We have everything, and we are happy to give you guaranteed supply and to co-develop a lot of these deposits with you. So that's one element, and Trump's ambitions for independence in critical minerals implies that he will need access to Australian critical minerals at some point. Right. So that's pretty useful. But then there are other elements we don't know about. The government is keeping quiet, but Don Farrell told me they are not trade-related, and they are not, he said, we are certainly not discussing or considering concessions on any of the non-tariff barriers, as the Americans have complained about, such as the pharmaceutical benefits scheme or other sensitive issues like that. Farrell says they're not on the table, but other items are, and because it's a current offer and we don't want to blow up the negotiation, we're not going to tell you what they are.
Okay, well, this is something I really wanted to end on, Peter, because when I read this in your piece, I thought, well, is there any pressure on the government, or do you feel we may see some soon to reveal what these elements are? Because I would have thought the electorate, I certainly want to know, so close to a federal election, just how our government plans to further align itself to Donald Trump and the United States.
Yes, it's a great question. There seems to be minimal pressure on Albanese. The opposition is not asking him to disclose what the other elements of the deal might be. I think Dutton has learned from his early association, his early flirtation perhaps, with trying to out-tough Albanese in standing up to America, that wasn't playing very well for him. And he's taken a much more bipartisan approach, more rallying around the flag and thereby the government and the Prime Minister. He's much less critical now of Albanese and the 10% tariff. There doesn't seem to be much pressure on Albanese to disclose, and there doesn't seem to be much awareness that this offer is still current on Donald Trump's desk.
Yeah, I didn't know that until I read your column. Like, what did you? Yeah, that's right. So, what did you think when Don Farrell, told you on the record? Yeah, this offer's still on the table. Many of the elements of what's on the offer is confidential. Were you also sort of,
Well, I was intrigued, and I asked what they were, and he wasn't going to tell me, and I haven't been able to find out.
Yes.
But it also, the fact that there was the Australian government to this point has still not received a response, a formal response to that deal, tells you that Trump was not interested in giving Australia an exemption from the beginning. That in this case, at least in this relationship, it wasn't about a bargain and it wasn't about a negotiation. They'd decided they were going to do it, and that's it.
Well, thank you so much, Peter, for your time.
Always a pleasure, Samantha.